Hello and welcome to week 15 of PUBH 612. Today we will be talking about Program Evaluators' responsibilities. This is chapter 16 in your text and it's the final week of the semester. The learning objectives for this week are to develop an informed consent document that includes the 8 required elements, to describe the evaluator's ethical and reporting responsibilities, to develop a final evaluation report, and to make sure that it includes an executive summary and recommendations. Informed consent is the agreement to participate voluntarily and willingly in a study, and it's based on a full disclosure of what constitutes participation in the study and the risk and benefits of participating. Here are 8 elements of informed consent. Don't forget to include number 8, which is your contact information for additional information about the study. And for some people, they may want to follow up with you, and if they have questions, they'll need to know who to contact. And whether or not you use an informed consent form is based on the requirements sometimes of the funder, or maybe the requirements of the agency which is providing the program, and the intent of the evaluation. So for instance, if the evaluation is only being used for internal purposes and not to generate knowledge, then the evaluation isn't considered research and informed consent is not required. Children are considered a vulnerable population, and therefore you will need to get parental consent and child assent in order for them to participate in an evaluation. This can result in lower participation rates among children. Other groups which are considered vulnerable populations can be domestic violence participants, staff, and you'll need to ensure that these people have their confidentiality is protected. With program staff, they may be facing other ethical issues, such as if they're legally mandated to report child abuse or other infectious diseases. These are all things that you should consider when working with vulnerable populations. The purpose of HIPAA is to protect personal information related to receiving health care. This includes an individual's birth date, address, date on which services were received, and diagnoses. The implications of HIPAA depend on whether the evaluator is an employee of the organization, if the organization falls under HIPAA requirements, if the evaluation is part of routine care, and whether or not the results will be made public. In order for change to occur and for decisions to be based on evaluation findings, individuals with decision-making authority need to be persuaded by the facts. When using statistical results, these 5 properties affect the persuasiveness of the evidence. We've discussed some of these previously. First is the magnitude of the intervention effect. This is the amount of change attributable to the program. Remember that people are inclined to believe good news, and so a larger intervention effect will increase the of the evaluation findings. Another property is the degree to which it articulates the findings. This means the statement should have detail and clarity. Being articulate may require the use of lay terminology that stakeholders can easily understand rather than more complex statistical terms. Generalizability is the wider applicability of the studies, and we've spoken about this term throughout the semester, and making sure you understand if the study has a strong external validity and will enable you to generalize the findings to other populations. The wider the applicability of the findings, the more persuasive the findings are. Fourth, how interesting your findings are, and if they challenge current beliefs, will determine their persuasiveness. Interesting findings attract more attention. And lastly, do the findings have credibility? We've also reviewed this term before, but again, we want to make sure that the methods and theoretical basis for your evaluation are sound and credible, and a credible study will also be more persuasive. Evaluators are expected to produce written and sometimes oral presentations of the evaluation findings. The format of the report is typically tailored to the situation and evaluation. Sometimes you'll have to stick to specific format required by your funder, but in general, your report should provide an overview of the program processes and outcome objectives. And you might use a table to provide a visual context and show which areas of the program were successful in meeting objectives. Most reports will contain an executive summary, which is a 1 to 2 page summary of the program and evaluation and the overall recommendations. This is the most widely read and distributed part of the report, so it should be powerful and include enough details to convince the reader that the program and design were appropriate. Other sections of the report are the program evaluation background and description, and a summary of findings and recommendations. Here are some general tips for making your graphs interpretable. You should be limiting graphs to key points and variables. Only use as many dimensions of the graph as there are in the data, so no need for 3D graphs if you have 2 different variables. Don't let labels interfere with seeing the data. Choose ranges on the axes that are reasonable. So if your data only goes from 1 to 10, no need for the scale on the axes to be from 1 to 100. Use category names for nominal or ordinal data, not numeric values. You should only be using line graphs when you have trend data. Titles should be sufficiently explanatory, and it's important that you choose the right variables and scale, and that's more important than the color scheme. In the end, you should make recommendations based on the data that you've collected. Recommendations should also be linked to program theory and should address organizational and service utilization plans. You may collect ideas for recommendations throughout the planning, implementation, and evaluation process, and you can also draw on outside sources as a justification. This could increase the credibility of your recommendations. Your recommendations should also make sense in the larger socio-political context, as well as the organizational context. And perhaps most importantly, your recommendations should be easy to understand. Some types of evaluations may be misused, and the findings could be distorted. This can occur at any point in the evaluation process, beginning with an inappropriate design that could be biased, and other findings could have been from resource constraints, self-interests, political pressures, etc. Misuse can be intentional, such as falsifying client satisfaction reports to make it look like everyone loved your program, or it could be unintentional, such as being too busy to distribute the client satisfaction surveys in the first place. You can help to minimize misuse by evaluation stakeholders by education and letting them know about what is an appropriate use. It's important to consider the relationship between the evaluator and the organization. There is the potential for third-party dynamics among organization, a funder, and an evaluator, as they may have different priorities for the program, as well as differing timelines, expectations, levels of commitment. And they also might have different professional and organizational cultures and different vocabulary. Another possible difference is the broader purpose of the evaluation. An evaluation for management focuses on individual units or programs for the purpose of making ongoing adjustments with an emphasis on performance and accountability. This is essentially a process monitoring evaluation. Versus a leadership evaluation, which tends to focus and look at the entire organization and long-term perspective. And it's collecting information across programs. You should negotiate early on who will own the evaluation data and how it will be disseminated. Dissemination is the intentional and systematic distribution of protocols, findings, and recommendations in a manner that makes the information accessible to a specific audience. You should make sure that your findings are available beyond the stakeholders that participated in the whole evaluation process, and you should consider publishing them in an academic journal or on a website. But you need to make sure that you think through any potential conflicts of interest, and if the published evaluation was conducted by a program developer, you may also need to discuss authorship and manuscript content with stakeholders from the beginning to ensure that everyone is on the same page. Sometimes stakeholders want to use the findings from an evaluation to change policy. There are two strategies needed to increase the use of evaluation results for policymaking. One strategy is to develop a communication network that allows for an exchange of information with the legislative stakeholders. This enables them to provide input into the evaluation design and process. While the other strategy is to communicate the findings effectively in an understandable and actionable way. Sometimes an evaluation is contracted for a government agency or a government-funded program, and there may be political pressure to frame the evaluation question or design the study in a certain way. There are three main ways to assess the quality of an evaluation. One is to see if the evaluation met the American Evaluation Association standards, which include utility, feasibility, accuracy, and propriety. The second approach is to confer with the users of the evaluation to determine if the information that you've collected is useful to them. The third is to assess its scientific rigor, and for the reviewer, to review the evaluator's characteristics, such as did they maintain independence, did they disclose any conflicts of interest, and did they maintain confidentiality, and lastly, did they keep records of the entire evaluation process. So the key takeaways for this week are to remember that informed consent is an important step if you are conducting research. So if you're just doing an evaluation for internal purposes, you don't need to worry about this step. But if you do decide that you need to get informed consent, you need to make sure that your informed consent document includes all of the 8 elements that are required and which we discussed today. Also, as an evaluator, you're going to be responsible for protecting vulnerable populations and for meeting ethical and reporting guidelines. Lastly, whatever information you do find, you want to make your evaluation user-friendly and easy to understand, and you should disseminate your findings as widely as possible. So both to the stakeholders that participated in your evaluation, as well as online, and to the broader community that will be impacted by your findings. That's it for this week. Here are some additional internet resources. There are some other ones here. And please go to Blackboard to see if there are any other additional materials.